Psalm 119 verse 18 says, "Open now mine eyes, that I may behold wondrous things out of thy law." Memorizing scripture is tough, and one of the difficulties that I encounter when memorizing long passages and chapters is just memorizing the order of the verses. Even if I feel like I know the verses themselves pretty well, sometimes remembering which one comes next is really a challenge. And one of the ways that I have been able to combat that is to just look for common themes in the verses. We might feel like verse 10 is a total change in subject that has nothing to do with verse 9, but most of the time, if we look closely, we'll find a connection. One example of that is in 1 John chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. John writes, "Not as Cain, who was of that wicked one, and slew his brother. And wherefore slew he him? Because his own works were evil, and his brother's righteous. Marvel not, my brethren, if the world hate you. We know that we have passed from death unto life, because we love the brethren. He that loveth not his brother abideth in death." At first glance, it might seem like these verses really have nothing to do with each other, but if we look closely, we'll see that they do. In verse 12, John uses Cain as an example of someone who failed to love his brother. And Abel was someone who was hated for his righteousness. And John tells us then in verse 13, not to be surprised if the world hates us too for our righteousness. And then in verse 14, he tells us that it's love and not hate that should characterize our relationships as Christians. And so understanding this connection really helps us then to keep those verses in the proper order in our minds. Another example is in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 2 through 3. Paul writes, "Preach the word. Be instant, in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort, with all longsuffering and doctrine. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears." And again, it might seem like these verses have nothing to do with each other, but if we look closely, we'll see that doctrine is the common issue that's at stake. And so in verse 2, Paul tells Timothy to preach sound doctrine, and then in the following verse, he warns him that sound doctrine will not be tolerated by some. And so as we memorize Scripture, it really does pay to take time to study the passage, to familiarize ourselves with the ideas that are being conveyed and the train of thought that's there. And it might take longer to do that. It might slow you down just a little bit, but that's time well spent. And in the long run, it will result in better memory work, longer retention, and best of all, a deeper and richer understanding of God's Word.